Hi guys, thanks for watching. Today we're going to talk about the HDPE molds. You've either already bought one, thanks very much, or you're thinking about buying one. So we're just going to have a look at and see how easy they are to use, how easy they are to construct and take apart, with just the simple addition of adding some silicone. So for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to make some coasters out of this piece of old sepia wood I had lying around. I know a lot of people don't have the facility to buy exotic wood, so we'll see how nice these coasters turn out just using wood which you can buy off the shelf. So let's get started. The molds themselves come pre-assembled, so it's just a question of adding silicone to the sides and you're good to go on your first project. However, you'll see here that there are machine bolts which allow the sides to be attached by the M4 screws. HDPE plastic really is the perfect material for non-stick molds for resin projects. Its non-adhesive quality does away with any need for any kind of release spray or duct tape, and it allows the molds to be completely reusable, potentially an infinite number of times. All the sides of the HDPE molds are machine cut to size and secured with threaded inserts and bolts, which allow for easy assembly and demolding. Plus the sides are straight, not tapered like some of the welded HDPE molds on the market, leading to less wasted resin and less finishing work. The molds can be constructed in a couple of minutes. The only additional requirement is, as is the case with the majority of molds, is just silicone is required along the edges. The machine drilled holes on the sides of the molds have been deliberately drilled off centre, which just saves any confusion about which side should go on the left or whether it in fact should go on the right. When attaching the sides and inserting the machine bolts into the threaded inserts, it's an idea just to not over tighten them. There's a couple of millimetres leeway which just allows you to manoeuvre the side so it's completely flush with either end. Once the ends have been married up, then you can tighten the machine bolts firmly into place. The mould I'm using here I've probably used between 15 and 20 times, and the sides still fit onto the base as easily as the first time that I built it. One of the things that can happen with the moulds, generally when they're being stored, is that the surfaces can become a little bit scratched. One of the other benefits of using HDPE is that this issue is easily redeemable. It's just a question of sanding with a pretty high grit and a white pad, and I'll give a demonstration on that later in the video. So before we add the silicone to the sides of the mould, we'll just have a quick look at the wood. As I mentioned before, this is just a piece of wood that I bought from a local hardware shop. It's nothing special, it's easy to work with. It's probably a good idea if it's the first time you're making these coasters to use something off the shelf. I've drawn a line down the length of the piece, just a curved line which I'm following with my jigsaw, and once the end has been measured it can then be chopped to make sure it fits tightly into the mould. It's a good idea to seal the edges of the wood before you place it into the mould to add the resin. There's two schools of thought on this. I mean, some people prefer to seal the edges, some people don't. Personally, I've tried both ways. I've never had any issues after I've sealed the edges, as long as you give it a bit of a key, a light sanding before you pour the final resin, then it's worked fine. Generally I always mix too much resin, so I seal the whole piece of wood. This can prevent staining of the wood if you are using colours, and particularly if you're using a lighter wood. Any resin that gets onto the lighter wood can potentially sink in and stain it. So I generally just seal the whole piece of wood. It's a two-part epoxy, 2-to-1, 24-hour drying time, so if you seal it the day before then you're good to go in the morning, which actually always works well. If you're sealing the edges of the mould with silicone the day before, then that will also be dry in preparation for pouring the epoxy the next day. So you've sealed the wood, you've sealed the edges of the mould with silicone, you let that dry overnight. You don't need to win any awards of the quality of the siliconing as long as it holds. It's a good idea when you come to it in the morning or after it has set, if you're not that confident or it's one of the first times you're doing these coasters. Just pour some water into the mould, make sure there's no leaks. However, before you do pour the resin in, make sure the mould is completely dry. So I've sanded the wood with a 240 grit paper just on the edge where the wood comes into contact with the resin. That provides a key for the resin to bond. These pieces of blocks I've just covered with a simple duct tape. You don't need to go to any great expense, just a simple packing tape. Make sure that all the wood is covered for those blocks, and then you can clamp your piece down into place. You only really need to clamp it to prevent the wood from floating. There's no need to over clamp. So just clamp down lightly, and that'll be more than adequate. And then you're good to pour the resin. The resin I'm using here is the same as I use to seal the edges of the wood. It's not a deep pour resin. In fact, the manufacturer's recommendations is only to pour up to 1 centimetre, 10 millimetres. The thickness of my wood is 1.8 centimetres, so it's right on it's above the limit, but as long as you keep the resin cool during the initial exothermic reaction, which is between 30 minutes and 4 hours after pouring, then the resin sets very well. The reason I'm doing it is because of the drying time. On a deep pour resin, you generally have to wait between 3 and 4 days, whereas this one I'm pouring at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and by the morning it will be good to work on. So I've measured the amount of resin that I need. The length of the mould is 60 centimetres. The depth of the wood is 1.8 centimetres, and the width is approximately 6 centimetres. So you times that together, you get 648 cubic centimetres. Working in litres works out very easy because it works out at 0.648 of a litre. I've rounded up to 0.9, which makes the ratios work much better. 0.9, you've got 600 grams of part A, 300 grams of part B. To mix it, I've just got a cocktail stick, off-centered it in the drill, so it gives you a nice mixture. Mix it for about 3 or 4 minutes. Just make sure that there's nothing stuck, none of the colouring stuck to the side. Leave it for probably a couple of minutes, let some bubbles rise to the surface, and then you're good to pour. There are numerous types of resin on the market which vary in price quite a lot. If you're going for a clear pour without any colorant, then possibly it's an idea to go for the more expensive resins. They generally filter out the microbubbles much better, but certainly if you're using the amount of colouring which I'm using here, then it's not necessary. Any microbubbles won't be visible. What is a good idea after you have poured is just to give the surface of the wood where it comes into contact with the resin just a wipe with the cocktail stick or a brush of some sort. That detaches any microbubbles from the surface of the wood. And then after that, just with a heat gun, within 2 or 3 minutes, you'll see that any bubbles have risen to the surface and they can be removed with the heat gun. After that process is complete, for this particular resin, which is Epoxy, I haven't really seen any necessity to go back, as there hasn't been any more bubbles that have appeared. During the curing process, you need to keep an eye on the temperature. Where I'm at the moment is about 22, 23 degrees outside, so it's a bit warm. I think I measured the resin here after about half an hour, 45 minutes. It was about 29, 30 degrees, which is fine. But it does increase. So I've just put a fan over it, and the temperature didn't get above 35 degrees, which is perfect. So I came back to the mould the following day. I probably left it about 15 or 16 hours. The blocks came off without any issue. This block here was touching the resin, but again, because of the tape around the block that the resin doesn't adhere to, there was no problems taking it off. No leaks, which was good. And then it's just a process of removing the machine bolts from the threaded inserts. All the moulds come with a 2.7mm Allen key to enable the machine bolts to be inserted and tightened. However, if you've got an attachment for your drill, then this makes the process of demolding much quicker. It's probably advisable to use the Allen key when you're putting the mould together, just so you don't overstress any of the connectors. You'll see the size of the moulds come away relatively easily. Any pieces that might need a bit of encouragement will just need a slight tap with a piece of wood, and once the seal has been broken, then the rest of the wool will come away very freely. What you probably will need just to remove the base of the mould is just a wedged shaped piece of wood, which will just put in between the mould and the base after the silicon's been removed. And a gentle tap, and then the base should come away without any issues. So the wood looks good, the resin's set well. You can remove any of the excess silicone from around the edges of the wood and the resin. You'll see that the underside of the wood, the resin seeped under, which is fine. That will all come off when we come down to our surface planer, or indeed when you sand it. Before we go on to the finishing process, we'll just have a quick look at the mould. There really is very little that needs to be done to the mould. The silicone comes off very easily. It just peels off. If you do find that any of the resin does stick, then just going over it with a Scotch white pad. They're very good. They're not abrasive, but enough to remove any debris that's been stuck to the sides. And that's it. Then you're good to go to re-pour for your next project. There's various ways that you can flatten the wood after it's come out of the mould. Ideally would be a belt sander. I don't have one. I wish I did. The next best option is the router sled, which I've got here. For those that are interested, I've done a separate video on the construction of this particular router sled, which I'll put in the link below. Otherwise, just a sanding machine, starting off with an 80 grit or 100 grit. As long as you keep the sander flat on the wood, then you'll be able to come out with the same result as a router sled does here. So you can see I'm just taking off a couple of millimeters off the top, which brings the resin in line with the wood. And then we turn it over, do the other side, and then that's it. So onto the sanding itself. I'm using the Festool Rotex sander here with Abranet sandpaper. It's always a good idea to put a backing pad onto the Festool if you're using the Abranet. Otherwise a hook and loop system will get worn down. The cost of this backing pad is €2 or €3, as opposed to a new backing pad for the Festool itself, which is probably about 50 or 60 bucks. So I'm starting off with a 120 grit. Passing a couple of times. A piece of this size doesn't require much sanding, just making sure that between papers, giving it a wipe down with a cloth. So you can see here, as I've turned it over, there's a couple of divots which have been chipped out from the router. It's nothing to be concerned about. We'll have a look at how to fix them now. Just a bit of CA glue with activator will do the trick. So just wipe off any excess. Get your CA glue, normal super glue. Put into the holes. You won't need much. Then you apply the activator. It's dry within 10 seconds or so. I know the manufacturers recommend waiting a minute, but literally within 10 seconds you're good to sand over it. Generally, any air bubbles or divots that are in the resin will become apparent at this stage when you're sanding with the lower grit papers, the 80s or the 120s. So this is the time that you want to rectify the issues. One thing it is important to note: don't try and colour match with the existing resin. Generally what I found is if you use clear, then clear will never be seen. If you try and start colour matching, then you really can come into problems, because it's an almost impossible task. So now it's on to trimming the edges. I'm only just taking off about the thickness of the blade here, about 2 millimeters, just to get rid of the excess resin which is attached to the wood, to leave a bare wood finish. And then we can come on to the other ends, which is easier to use a chop saw. You can see here the little black mark which was caused by the machine not being at full speed when I started the cut. So I just rectified that by going over it again. The design and the size of the mould has been made to produce 6 coasters. Obviously you want every coaster to be exactly the same size. So to this effect, the best way to do it is just secure a piece of block to the chop saw itself. Then every time you remove one coaster, just move the whole piece along until it's flush with the block, until it's touching the block. And then you'll be able to produce 5 cuts, which will then give you your 6 coasters. There may be a slight excess at the end, a couple of millimeters, but that's to be expected. Don't worry too much about the saw marks on the resin or the wood. They can be sanded out. However, if you do get some burn marks, like you saw that I had before, then it is worth trimming them. You only need to shave off less than half a mil to get rid of the burn marks, but if you try and sand them off, A, it takes a long time, and B, you'll get a non-uniform finish, which is not what you want. When it comes to finishing the edges of the coasters, it's a little bit more tricky because of their size. So here I'm just demonstrating what I use to finish the the corners of a chopping board that I'm doing, just to give it an eighth of an inch roundover bit. But what these large routers have a tendency of doing is just tilting over. So by attaching it to this board, as long as you keep pressure on the board itself, you won't have that issue. So here you can see that I've secured the router and the board upside down on the workbench. I'm just going to finish one side of the coasters. The other side I'll just hand sand just to remove the sharp edge. The other thing to mention is that if you have the facility to do this outside, then it's probably advisable to do so unless you have very good extraction inside. It's amazing how much mess either sanding, planing or routing resin makes. So now we're back inside. I've just secured the sander upside down, or loosely secured it. I'm just going to finish off with a 400 grit. Really, this gives you the nice finish on the resin, plus it gets rid of any marks that have been caused either through the cutting or through the routing process. So every corner just swiped over, each side obviously. Once you've done this with all 6 coasters, then you're good to go for the final coat of whatever product you want to use. I should mention that prior to reaching the 400 grit stage, we went through the 120, the 180, 240, 320, and then we finished our sides with the router, and then onto the 400 for the final grit finishing. So on to the last step of the process. I'm using the Osmo 1101 Poly-X oil. Just cut a piece of white pad, which I'm using to apply it to the coasters. Osmo's the product that I prefer. I mean, there are various other types which I've tried, but I generally come back to the Osmo. There's the 1101, which I'm using here, or the 3032, which has a slightly higher viscosity. When I spoke to Osmo, they said that on the 1101, because it's a lower viscosity, it generally seeps into the wood for a harder wood, and the 3032, or in fact it's 3043 in some countries. It's for hardwood also, but possibly more porous wood. One of the things they did mention is that when you do apply the Osmo, you need to leave it for a while to let it sink in. In fact, you need to feed it. So if there's some areas which are slightly less dense than others, then after 20 minutes or so, then you come back and you add a bit more until the wood is relatively saturated, and then left it for another 25 minutes, half an hour or so, and then you can start polishing. So I'm back with the Festool upside down again, this time with a white felt pad attached to it. It gives a nice finish to the coasters. I'm only going to give one coat of Osmo. If you apply a second coat, then it gives a slightly glossier finish. And in fact, I know a lot of people apply 2 or 3 coats, depending on the finish that you want. But certainly from a protective perspective, 1 coat is more than sufficient. So there you have it, guys. I hope this has been a good demonstration of the results that can be achieved utilising wood from your local hardware store. I'm going to be putting out a video for the chopping board that you saw me routing the edges from before. So if you're keen to see that one, then hit the subscribe button, and then you'll be able to see that when it becomes available. But before we go, I just want to demonstrate how it is if you do develop any scratches on the HDPE. This scratch was caused whilst the mould was being stored, and foolishly I put some sharper objects on top of it. But it's not an issue, it's just a question of sanding it down with a 400 grit paper. I'm using the Abranet again, so just remembering to put the backing pad onto the Festool. So you give it a light sanding for a couple of minutes or so. That will remove the scratches. You will be left with a slightly textured surface on the HDPE, which you can then rectify just with a white pad. And in doing so, that will bring your HDPE surface back to new. That's all for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you've seen the benefits of using the HDPE moulds. As always, if you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to leave it in the comments section below.